So we're continuing on with stories at the moment for the next few weeks, and Ngakpa is going to tell us some stories of Tsar Patrul Rinpoche and Khyentse Rinpoche this evening.
Good evening. I have three stories, and the first two come from the time when Kyabje Kunzang Dorje Rinpoche was being extremely fierce with Ngakcham Rinpoche, and the last story is for a time where the attitude was somewhat different. You'll see. This is from a chapter called A Limping Sheep, and the first story is about a limping sheep. Having entered Rinpoche's room and performed prostrations, I sat in eager anticipation mixed with dread. Rinpoche ignored me. He was busy with some text and was arranging the order of the pages. Tibetan texts are all loose-leaf compilations contained between two wooden boards. They're then wrapped in cloth and bound closed with a fabric tape. Rinpoche occasionally looked up at me or at Pema Dorje as if he were checking how many of us there were. It was only ever a cursory flick of the eyes in our direction, and he made no statement as to how long he would be occupied. I started wondering, after about a quarter of an hour, whether we should suggest coming back later, but realized that if Rinpoche had wanted us to go and come back at another time, he was quite capable of conveying that information. Rinpoche suddenly spoke. Stories of Do Khyentse are widely known. Maybe you have heard stories of Do Khyentse. Yes, Rinpoche. What stories? He barked. I heard one about Do Khyentse reanimating a wild blue sheep after he and his disciples had eaten it. Oh yeah, this is one story. But do you know the meaning? I think I do. Ha, you think. Too much thinking. Always too much thinking. Tomyo. But no clarity. Anyhow, we will see. I will tell this story, and then I will question you. Then you must know the meaning. On one occasion, after killing a wild blue sheep, Do Khyentse instructed his disciples to take the meat and roast it over a fire. The fire was burning merrily, and the smell of the roast sheep was wafting amongst the eagerly gathered nostrils of Do Khyentse's disciples. One disciple, however, was having some sort of religious idiot ideas about this sheep butchering. Do Khyentse, sensing his spiritual doubt, said, "Be careful to preserve the skin and the bones." At the end of the feast, Do Khyentse said to the doubting disciple, "Now bring the skin and bones, lay them out in front of me, as they would naturally be from the sheep." Do Khyentse then sat in silence for a while, before suddenly snapping his fingers. The sheep jumped up, shook itself in its hide, and trotted away. The sheep was limping a little, however, because the doubting disciple had omitted to replace one small piece of bone. "What do you learn from this?" "That," I stumbled, "you shouldn't have doubt about the Lama." Rinpoche shook his head. "Tomyo," he sighed. "This is the answer you have learned how to give. All Tomyos can give this answer. That is not why I tell you stories. I do not want to hear conventional answers. I want you to use your natural intelligence. I do not want you to parrot the teachings you've received." I was back in the jungle with the tiger again. I thought I'd made some headway, and suddenly I was back at the beginning, giving idiot answers. Rinpoche was poised for a lethal pounce. I realized I'd be thrown out if I didn't come up with something better almost immediately. So I blurted, "Precision, Rinpoche. A disciple has to be precise in following instructions, or there is no transmission." Rinpoche nodded. "Ha! Why did you not say this first?" "I don't know, Rinpoche." "You must know. It's bad enough to be a Tomyor, but not to know why you say what you say is to be worse than a Tomyor. Now, answer again. And this time, do not answer like a Tomyor, or you must leave."
Do you need to explain Tomyor?
Tomyor means idiot, basically. I answered as I did because I thought it was an answer that showed something important about Vajrayana. Yeah, Tomyor. This is merely a proper answer. This is an answer that people learn to give. This is how Tomyors learn. They learn all the proper answers, and then they give these answers and become parrots. Rinpoche then made noises like a squawking parrot. We then sat in silence for 10 minutes, 10 minutes of purgatory. I wondered what would happen next, but at least I'd not been thrown out. Rinpoche had been looking out of the window, but suddenly he turned to me with a furious look. The fury, however, translated into another story rather than a reprimand. The Gyalpo of Derge had been a benefactor of Jigme Lingpa. Did you know this? No, Rinpoche. No, Rinpoche, he replied, imitating the hint of whine in my voice. Yeah, Tomyor. Do Khyentse was recognized as the incarnation of Jigme Lingpa, and so the Gyalpo thought he ought to revere him. Hang on, have I gone 2 pages? No. The Gyalpo thought he ought to revere him, like you think you ought to revere me. Rinpoche said nothing for a moment or two, and then shouted, "You have something to say?" What was I to say to that? Well, sure, I did think I ought to revere Rinpoche, because Kyabde Dujam Rinpoche sent me to him to receive Dzogchen Menakde, so how could I not revere him? But was there any reverence that was not connected with Dujam Rinpoche? I'd obviously taken too long thinking about it, because Rinpoche shouted, "If you have nothing to say, you must leave, so speak now or go." I do think that I ought to revere you, Rinpoche, because Kyabde Dujam Rinpoche sent me to you. But that doesn't mean that I won't come to revere you from my own experience, but it's still very early, and I ran out of words at that point. Oh yeah, good answer. This is not a Tomyor answer, so I will continue. So this Gyalpo wanted Do Khyentse to live and give teachings in Derge. He wanted to own him as his own Lama. Do you think you can own Kunzang Dorje? No, Rinpoche. Oh yeah, and Kunzang Dorje does not own you. Anyhow, because the Gyalpo wanted to have Do Khyentse as his personal Lama, there was much jealousy among the spiritual idiots in those parts. Do Khyentse came to hear of the jealous idiots and decided to leave Gyarong. He traveled through Golok and Mongolia, manifesting Mahasiddha activities. The Gyalpo of Derge came to hear of this and felt an even greater desire to have Do Khyentse as his personal Lama. The Gyalpo sent grand invitations to Do Khyentse, but he never replied. The Gyalpo then sent representatives to invite Do Khyentse, but he refused. The Gyalpo then wrote, "If you don't come soon, I shall send my army to escort you to my dzong." Dzong means fortress. This warning also failed to move Do Khyentse. The Gyalpo then promised vast offerings, but again he got no response. In desperation, the Gyalpo inquired of Do Drupchen, "What can I do? Nothing works to bring Do Khyentse to Derge." Do Drupchen replied, Do Khyentse's activity only resonates with those who are ready to understand it. There is no way for people who cannot understand. Maybe if you give up with your attempts to force the issue, he may come. But you will need to be open-minded and not try to change Do Khyentse Rinpoche. He is a Mahasiddha. You will not be able to place conditions on him, as you would with any other Gyalpo's personal Lama. So the Gyalpo resolved to rid his mind of demands, or at least to desist in writing and sending representatives. Then one day, out of the blue, Do Khyentse arrived. He appeared dressed as a Mongolian, and without preparation gave the Gyalpo empowerments and teachings. The Gyalpo was delighted. He requested Do Khyentse to be his Lama and made his request with great fervency. But Do Khyentse refused. My understanding of Dharma is too unconventional. My way of living is too offensive to conservative society. I butcher sheep and eat the meat, so I cannot be any Gyalpo's Lama. The Gyalpo was bewildered and said, but you've just given empowerments and teachings, and these were all in perfect accordance with Dharma. Yeah, that's as may be. But you will see who I am if I remain in your land a day or two. Then over the next days, Do Khyentse displayed extraordinary behavior. He wore a hat made from the branches of a tree. He rode his horse bareback with the saddle strapped to his back. Then he dismounted, removed his clothes, and walked back and forth in front of the Langdar Gompa, howling like a wolf. Next time, he appeared wearing leaves, then dressed as a woman, then as a Mongolian warrior, then as a Drokpa from Hor. The Gyalpo, seeing these displays, attempted without success to dissuade him from manifesting eccentric behavior. And Do Khyentse said, as I told you, I am not a Lama you would want. My understanding of Dharma is too unconventional. My way of living is too offensive to conservative society. The Gyalpo apologized, but at heart he was still of the same mind on the subject. Anyhow, whilst all this was taking place, Derge was suffering from drought. The temperature had risen and the crops were dying. The Gyalpo asked the ecclesiastics of Katog and Dzogchen Gompas for help. They tried, but they could do nothing to alleviate the drought. Recognizing their failure, they suggested, why don't you ask Do Khyentse? He's famous as a miracle worker, but maybe ask him to dress in the correct way when he performs his rites. I will do as you suggest, but I cannot ask him to change his dress. I tried that, and he really doesn't like to be asked. Yes, we know that. But anyway, this won't be good for religion in this area, and he must be brought to understand this, said the ecclesiastic idiots. If he performs miracles dressed like a nomad, people will lose respect for the ecclesiastic hierarchy, and that would be bad for religion in general. You must see that. Yes, I see that, but it will not be easy. I will see, but first we must end the drought. The ecclesiastics agreed that it was important to stop the drought, but insisted that as soon as the drought was ended, the Gyalpo should insist that Do Khyentse wear conventional religious robes. The Gyalpo wasn't too happy about this, but went to Do Khyentse and requested help. I will gladly help, replied Do Khyentse, but you'll have to settle for my methods and my clothing, and they might not please you. I have no objection to anything you do, as long as it brings rain for the crops. Well, I don't need to dress like a woman for this, Do Khyentse replied, knowing that the Gyalpo was worried about his clothing, but I'll have to knock a hole in the sky. Are you prepared for that? Certainly, whatever you do is fine. Well, get your people to prepare 4 huge sharp nails and a hammer with a handle the length of my leg. The nails and hammer were prepared as requested, and Do Khyentse appeared dressed in his sheepskin chuba, doubled down from the waist to leave his torso unclothed. Grasping the hammer in his right hand and 4 huge nails in his left, he approached the Gyalpo Dzong. He attached iron chains to the nails and pounded them into the sky in the 4 cardinal directions. Sweat streamed from Do Khyentse's chest and shoulders as he pulled on the nails, and even more so when he began to pull on the chains. A swirling vortex appeared in the sky between the nails, and a roaring sound began to swell. The air trembled, sparks flew from the nails, and smoke to be emitted from the vortex he had created in the sky. Soon, dark clouds obscured the sun, and rain began to fall. Seeing the rain, the Gyalpo was overjoyed, but immediately his mind turned to the question of appeasing the local ecclesiastics. He'd have to talk with Do Khyentse the next day. No sooner had this thought occurred to him than the rain became torrential, and the water eventually threatened the land with flooding. The Gyalpo ran immediately to Do Khyentse and begged for his help. Again, Do Khyentse gave his help, and the flood dissipated. Do Khyentse gave the Gyalpo, his court, and all the people advice on how to maintain their country and ensure rain in due season. They all agreed to follow Do Khyentse's advice, and famine was averted from Derge for many years. The Gyalpo decided to forget the admonitions of the local ecclesiastics, as he was worried about approaching Do Khyentse with questions of clothing after the miracles he had performed. The local ecclesiastics, however, were unmoved by the miracles. Miracles or not, Do Khyentse is still wearing a white nomad's lambskin chuba. This is too bad, and something must be done. Really, now you must use your influence and ask Do Khyentse to dress in proper religious clothes. The drought has been averted, and now there's no risk of famine. After some argument that would be tedious to detail, the Gyalpo agreed to approach Do Khyentse on the subject. Rinpoche, I offer great thanks for your help. You have saved the crops and averted famine. But could you not placate the local ecclesiastics by wearing something that looks just a little more like religious clothing? Yeah. I knew that this would be the way it would work. If that's your attitude, I'm leaving. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked, but please wear whatever you like, but please do not leave, pleaded the Gyalpo. No, Do Khyentse replied. I told you it wouldn't work, and it hasn't worked. The idiots here will remain idiots, and they'll never stop trying to make me be as they want me to be. I told you how it would be, and you've seen for yourself. Do Khyentse mounted up and rode away, never to return to that area. Now, Rinpoche began, you have shown that you do not need to answer like a Tomyo. Tell me what you understand from this. This was much easier for me somehow, so I answered without hesitation. The Gyalpo is a weak man. He wants Do Khyentse as his Lama, but allows his desire to be destroyed by others. If he really wanted Do Khyentse as his Lama, more than anything else, he would not have tried to change him to suit the dictates of conventional religion. Oh yeah, Rinpoche shouted, but with fierce approval rather than fierce censure. You see, you do not have to be a Tomyo. But there is more to say. What is the Gyalpo's other mistake? Again, that was an easy question to answer. He wanted his own Do Khyentse, and a student, even if he's a king or local prince, cannot own his Lama. Sorry, he wanted to own Do Khyentse, and a student, even if he's a king or local prince, cannot own his Lama. Guru Rinpoche showed this when Trisong Detsen expected to be excused when it came to offering prostrations. Guru Rinpoche singed his beard with a sheet of flame. Trisong Detsen saw his error and performed prostrations. Rinpoche sat staring at me for some minutes. I could not fathom what his look betokened. At one point, I got the vaguest of impressions that he was trying to repress a smile. Eventually, he spoke. "Oh yeah, this is well spoken. Now maybe it is enough for today. In some things you are not a Tomyor, so we shall have to see tomorrow what you are." Rinpoche smiled faintly. Yeah, this was a good answer. Then I ruined it all. "Thank you, Rinpoche." "What? Tomyor, there is nothing to thank. Do you think I say this to please you? Do you think Kunzang Dorje is a flatterer?" "No, Rinpoche, I just wanted to be polite." Yeah, Tomyor. Maybe come back again the day after tomorrow. Maybe you sit all day tomorrow and try to gain clarity. Just bear with me a moment. And the next chapter is called Damn Right Nyosho.
Next story.
Sorry, next story.
And this is later.
This is later when Ngakchen Rinpoche has proved himself not to be a Tomyor. Oh yeah, good. Now today, I want to tell you a story of Patrul and Khyentse, but it mainly concerns Nyosho. This is one of my favorite stories. You will enjoy this. Especially now you are not a Tomyor, or rarely a Tomyor. I want you to listen carefully to what Patrul says when he speaks to Nyosho, and also what Khyentse says to Nyosho. There's transmission in their speech? Oh yeah, Rinpoche exclaimed with enthusiasm. Now all these things are clear to you. Now maybe there is no need for Kunzang Dorje to be fierce. Possibly, Rinpoche, but you never know with me. I'll do my best and avoid formulaic answers and all that stuff. Yeah. Anyhow, just be natural. Patrul was biding his time. He was in mountain retreat with his disciples, doing and saying little apart from what seemed needed in the moment. He wasn't one for shooting the breeze, but then one day the wind changed. A breeze laden with the fragrance of highland herbs stirred in the hermitage. Nyosho didn't really notice. Nyosho looked a little flat and enervated. Patrul took a sideways glance at Nyosho and, perceiving his dull state of mind, called out, "Hey, Nyosho, get lively now." Nyosho jumped a little on hearing his lama's voice directed at him in such a crisp manner. He apologized for his flatness of affect, but Patrul waved his hand to indicate that apologies weren't necessary. Patrul grinned. "Why don't you and me both take a long walk over yonder?" Nyosho was still taken in these words when he realized that Patrul had leapt to his feet and was packing up an overnight sack. He quickly grabbed his own appurtenances and rammed them into a bag to hitch up onto his back. Soon they were both headed off at a brisk pace in the direction of the highland pastures. "Sheep country," Patrul quipped over his shoulder in an unnecessarily loud voice. This obviously amused Patrul greatly, but Nyosho had no inkling of what might be amusing in such a statement. He scrambled after his lama with as much decorum as he could muster. After 3 hours' walk, without a word exchanged, they heard a crack that echoed ominously amongst the mountains. "Yo!" Patrul shouted to his disciples' alarm. "Do you hear that? Do you hear that?" Yes, Nyosho returned to sound. Maybe distant thunder? "Thunder, all right, my lad," Patrul yelled, "but not the sort of thunder that brings rain," he whispered in a mock conspiratorial manner. Nyosho looked perplexed, so Patrul confided in an immense bellow, "That is the sound of liberation." Again, Nyosho had no idea what his teacher was talking about. Patrul strode ahead, appearing disinterested in elucidation. Nyosho inquired no further. Soon, they saw a great herd of sheep in the distance. Nyosho had some slight sense of foreboding that made him feel he should say something. "There are sheep in the distance," he observed. "Damn right, Nyosho." Patrul smiled broadly. "You could be on to something, eh?" he murmured, with a conspiratorial air that was almost ludicrous. There was definitely some private joke afoot, but it was not to become apparent. This, thought Nyosho, must have got something to do with sheep, but he couldn't get any further with his line of reasoning. They continued to walk. Soon they were up in the high pastures among the sheep. They seemed unusually lacking in nervousness for sheep, and Nyosho remarked on it. "They seem unusually lacking in nervousness for sheep." Again, Patrul's rejoinder was oblique and impenetrable. "Foregone conclusion, Nyosho, foregone conclusion, just as we should have expected. They are Khyentse's flock, make no mistake." Patrul was obviously elated. He strode ahead vigorously, in spite of his advancing years. Having climbed the ridge that lay before them, they halted momentarily to catch breath. Patrul shaded his eyes to get a clearer view of the distance. "Yo, Nyosho!" Patrul shouted at mighty volume, even though he was right next to his disciple. "There, look! There is the Ga of Khyentse Yese Doje Rinpoche." Nyosho almost leapt out of his skin at the shout, but composed himself quickly enough, having got used to Patrul's sudden penchant for loud statements. And yes, there it was. In the distance, he could just make out small white flecks that could quite possibly have been tents. They were a long way off, but it was evident that this was their destination. Now, Nyosho had heard a lot about Khyentse, but what he had heard was all utterly astonishing. The Lama was an enlightened maniac by all accounts, and held in the very highest esteem by many Nyingma Lamas. It was said by some that he was one of the greatest living masters of his age. He was the incarnation of Jigme Lingpa. Fragments of a picture began to shape themselves, but Nyosho could not manage to tie them together in a way that made any sense. Patrul was certainly acting in a singularly strange manner. But why? What was this shouting all about? Something unusual was evidently in the air, but what it could be, Nyosho could not guess. Khyentse had known about his visitors since early that morning, and now he espied the pair from a distance. He knew through his innate clarity that his disciple Patrul Rinpoche was coming. He knew also that with him, Patrul had a disciple of his own, a man who needed to break through some obstacles. They would have travelled all day by foot, and they would doubtless be tired and hungry, so preparations were made for their comfort. A tent had been arranged for their privacy. Bedding had been appropriated and arranged in a commodious manner. Food had been organised and was in the process of being cooked. Chang had been allocated and stood waiting in wooden pitchers ready to quaff. When the two lamas arrived, disciples of Khyentse came to meet them and escorted them into the maniacal Drukchen's tent. Khyentse welcomed them in a grand style and bade them sit on the thick pile of sumptuous carpets and sheepskins arranged for them. He was dressed in a fine chuba made of lambskins and sat on the scattered skins of leopards and tigers. They found Khyentse in the final stages of cleaning, oiling, and reassembling his rifle. The sight of the rifle was a bit much for Nyosho. He had certain ideas about that kind of thing. Nonetheless, he sat down along with Patrul, and the three lamas talked. They talked about the way things had been, the way things were going, and the way things might turn out. A somewhat matter-of-fact conversation with no particular spiritual inclination as far as Nyosho could ascertain. But every time Do Khyentse addressed him, it was with some extraordinary appellation, such as dangerous ruffian, savage barbarian, audacious scallywag, incongruous reprobate, degenerate miscreant, or impetuous rapscallion. Nice rifle, Rinpoche, commented Patrul. Certainly, British, not some miserable Indian musket or old smoothbore. This is an Enfield, a pattern 1853 with a rifled barrel. Came from India last month. I've been waiting on this for a good while now. Damnedest thing I ever saw. Do Khyentse chuckled, passing the gun to Patrul. Shoots well? Patrul inquired, whilst examining the various functioning components of the weapon. Damn right, laughed Do Khyentse. Each phrase that Do Khyentse turned was delivered with shocking volume. It was eerily similar to the style Patrul had employed during their trek up to the Gar. The pieces of a picture in Noshal's mind looked as if they were going to assemble themselves coherently for an instant, but they didn't. Noshal's bewilderment simply escalated. Do Khyentse was continuing with some discussion of powder, shot, and muzzle velocity, and he caught sight of his attendants in his peripheral vision. Ah, he yelled, but I see a feast is ready and dispatched with this very gun in honor of your visit. Patrul had passed the rifle to Nyoshul only moments before. Nyoshul was engaged in a personal struggle to find something interesting about this horrible implement of death. When Do Khyentse made his announcement about its recent use. Butchered just for you. What do you think about that, eh, Nyoshul, my boy? Nyoshul was mortified. Finding himself minutely observed by both lamas, he squirmed grievously. He gave a sickly smile as he passed the weapon back to its ferocious owner. Thank you, Rinpoche, being all he could manage to say. He was now feeling monstrously uncomfortable and wondering why Patrul had brought him into the presence of this lama who was doing his best to manifest as the most frightfully depraved hedonist one could imagine. He had heard that Do Khyentse was a wrathful, mercurial teacher, but this had gone way past anything he could have imagined. Now Nyoshul knew Patrul to be vegetarian, and so things started looking even worse when his master started slamming into the lamb with unconcealed gusto. Nyoshul knew that not only was Patrul vegetarian, but that his teacher would go out of his way to save life wherever he could. Nyoshul had often seen Patrul refuse to visit nomad camps if he knew there was any chance of an animal being killed for the specific purposes of feeding his party. He was not one of those lamas who believed in the concept of the heart not grieving over anything the eye had not seen. Patrul didn't believe in innocence through contrived ignorance, and yet here he was, acting completely out of character. It was like a bad dream. Looking at Nyoshul's dazed expression, Do Khyentse hacked off an enormous steak of lamb and hefted it deftly into Nyoshul's bowl, yelling, "Hey, Nyoshul, you murderous little sod, get your diabolical gnashers round this." Nyoshul gasped, but his devotion to Patrul was such that he thanked his utterly shocking host and proceeded to nibble at the slaughtered flesh as if it had been roasted for his personal anguish. It was so evident that he was not enjoying his food that Patrul noticed his timid, lackluster style and nudged him in the ribs. "Eat, eat," Patrul encouraged. Poor Nyoshul, this was an abhorrent ordeal for him. He was practically bug-eyed with confusion as Do Khyentse and Patrul devoured abundant servings of meat. Having concluded their repast and cut the grease with some rather excellent chang, Patrul requested some brief essential teaching. Do Khyentse acceded with alacrity and spontaneously revealed something that he'd kept long hidden. "For many years I wanted to give you this teaching, Patrul, and tonight is the night." He winked at Nyosho as if he were about to tell a ribald joke. I'm extremely happy to give it to you now. You've waited long enough. Khyentse took a long, careful look at Nyosho, who was by now practically deranged. And this drooling debauchee here, this insatiable inebriate, he can also receive this teaching. He's a funny little fellow, but he has a good heart and a fine appetite for lamb. Nyosho was somewhat aghast at being described as a debauchee, but felt himself unusually privileged nonetheless. To receive a transmission from such a master was a rare thing, no matter how bewildering the circumstances. And so it was. It was the most serially direct of pointing out instructions, the most brilliantly eloquent yet refreshingly simple teaching. Nyosho was utterly rapt. His attention was totally absorbed with the words of Khyentse. Once the teaching was concluded, Nyosho was left in complete shock, bewildered incomprehension. Khyentse was a realized Lama who toted a gun, an enlightened master who slaughtered sheep. This was the most terrible ambivalence, but somehow he'd gone so far into experiential overload that he was quite relaxed. There was nothing left with which to struggle. When Patrul and Nyosho took their leave at the conclusion of the teaching, Khyentse touched foreheads with them both. He looked lovingly at Nyosho for the first time since he arrived and wished him a comfortable night. In the friendliest, most gracious manner, it was quite uncharacteristic for Khyentse to behave in a style befitting a venerable ecclesiastic. But on this occasion, he manifested the benign serenity one might expect of the archetypal saint. Nyosho, almost paralytic with pure pleasure, was reeling as he made his way to the tent set aside for them. Before entering and bedding down for the night, he and Patrul stood for a while looking at the stars. What a day! What a day! Patrul exclaimed, taking in the endless view. I've been your teacher for a long stretch, haven't I? Dear Nyosho, but I've never given you anything as marvelous as you've just received. Nyosho was speechless, but it didn't matter. There was nothing to say. You know, my friend, with all my experience, I couldn't guarantee to send you to the copper-colored mountain if you were to die tonight, Patrul sighed. What a pity the two of us couldn't be sheep in this marvelous herd. Every sheep here will find itself liberated into that dimension in the instant of its death. Nyosho's eyes filled with tears. Then, Khyentse Yeshidoji is, in reality, none other than Padmasambhava. Patrul smiled warmly at Nyosho and quietly and very gently said, Damn right, Nyosho. So, what is the meaning of this? Rinpoche asked. Transmission, I replied, an extremely powerful transmission. I can't imagine Nyosho not being changed forever by that. Oh yeah, Rinpoche smiled. This was necessary. Rinpoche detected my question and answered it before I could put it into words. Necessary because Nyosho had become hard. Not hard like a stone, but hard like milk that has dried on the edge of a bowl. It is not milk and is not cheese. It's merely a rind of grease. There's no possibility there without movement. Am I like that, Rinpoche? Rinpoche shook his head from side to side, laughing. No, no, nothing like that. You're too emotional to be like that. Not emotionally ridiculous like a Tomyor, but you feel strongly, and that makes you awake to everything. This is good, but you have to have strength to carry this emotion. This is Changchub Sem, and a Changchub Sempa must be a warrior. Do you think I can be a warrior? Rinpoche laughed and then gazed at me affectionately. You have no choice. Yeah, you will see. You will have a long life, and you will see.
Thank you. Wonderful.